So the question I'm asking in my paper is why economic power is, as a rule, not defined to dealt with as an institution. The problem is that economic power is generally not even seen as a problem. It is rarely discussed in theoretical debates, and it is only exceptionally the subject of policy decision-making. I open my paper with Lapo Berti and his call for limiting economic power. He characterized excessive wealth and economic power in private hands as a problem that afflicts contemporary democratic regimes. Yet this is not taken issue with, and it is, moreover, not even named. He also reminded us that the constitutions that from the beginning of modernity regulate the life of our societies do not deal with economic power. Among the powers which our constitutions are trying to temper control, Berti says economic power does not figure. Berti was an Italian Marxist who belonged to the operaismo movement. In the early 1970s, he and his colleagues engaged in analysis of the world economic crisis of the time. They observed an enormous expansion of the boundaries of monetary policy and observed that money had become an institution with a high political value. As such, as an institution, money was part of the governance of society. The analysis of the changing forms of economic power led them to, and were partly based on, rereading Marx, especially his articles from the mid-1850s in the Credit Immobilier. The Credit Immobilier was the first appearance of investment banking in nascent European capitalism, but it was also an institution created by new Bonapartist regime in France. Marx's analysis of the institutional organization of the money form became the point of departure for his analysis of capital, but also for a critique of Bonapartism as the first accomplished form of the modern state. So we are here, that is in the 1850s, in the mid-19th century, at the junction in history that witnessed crucially important developments of modern political power and economic power. That was also a very interesting time with regard to social and political theory, even if that period doesn't get much attention. But since Uroš talked about the permanent revolution as one of the problems, we are here at the time of the counter-revolution, which is a weak point both among the liberals and the socialists. They don't really know how to think about it, and in a way we are living in a permanent counter-revolution. So I hope, going back to that time, I hope I will show that going back to the time has some relevance for how we face our predicament today. A special argument for my argument is that we find here, that is in 1850s, both strong elements for the analysis of economic power, as well as general omission to develop that analysis. I'm primarily interested in that omission. In order to exemplify what I mean, I will focus on an author who is little known today, but had a considerable influence in the third quarter of the 19th century, August Ludwig von Rochau. Von Rochau was a German left liberal. After the 1848 revolution, he turned to a more realistic understanding of politics, and as a writer, as a national liberal politician, eventually supported Bismarck and the unification of German lands under the Russian leadership. In 1853, he published the Principles of Realpolitik. Some credit him with inventing the term realpolitik, but that's debatable as all such cases, but he certainly introduced it into public debate. Under his banner, he redefined liberal politics in Germany. The crucial impulse for his rethinking politics, however, was political developments in France, especially Louis Bonaparte's coup d'etat of 1851. I find von Rochau's work on realpolitik of particular interest because he formulated the law of power, yet left economic power out of its scope. So I'll first outline von Rochau's notion, very briefly, von Rochau's notion of realpolitik, and interpret the notion in the historical, political, theoretical context, and I will conclude with looking at the status of economic power within the liberal, realistic view of politics. So, von Rochau's starting point is the state. His objective is to define the dynamic basic role of the state. The state, according to him, is the political organism of human society whose existence is based on natural necessity. That natural necessity, however, is understood historically. In a historically given state, it is fulfilled through the interaction of manifold social forces whose composition, measure, and results endlessly change with time and place. The starting point of all political understanding, he writes, is the study of the forces that shape, maintain, and transform the state, and its first step leads to the following insight: that the law of power dominates the life of the state in a similar way that the law of gravitation dominates the material world. The old doctrines of the state fully understood that the truth about which he was talking, yet they drew from it a false and baleful conclusion that the right of the stronger, that the stronger has the right. In modern times, Rochau explained this unethical and erroneous conclusion that the stronger has the right was corrected. Yet at the same time, something important was lost out of sight. The real power of the stronger, whose importance in and for the state needed necessarily to be recognized. This error, says von Rochau, is the cause of the grossest blunders and heaviest defeats of the constitutional politics committed and suffered in European states for some generations. So this implied the critique of the revolution, the 1848 revolution. Von Rochau turned away from constitutional politics. The examination of the question of who ought to govern, whether the right, wisdom, or virtue, whether one or few or many, says Rochau, this question belongs to the realm of philosophical speculation. The practical politics first has to deal with the simple fact only that power alone is what can govern. To govern means exercising power, and so only he who has power can exercise power. This direct connection between power and governing is the basic truth of all politics and the key to the entire history. Whereas von Rochau's view of politics was definitively state-centered, his view of the state was equally clearly not constitution-centered. Just like other political thinkers of the first half of the 19th century, who were perceptive of social and political changes of the time, von Rochau abandoned the classical way of thinking of politics in terms of the forms of government or constitutions. He left the forms of government to philosophical speculation and put the fact, Tatsache, so this is a word that appears ever again in his work, so he put the fact of strength, force and power at the center of thinking about practical, that is, real politics. In this regard, too, he was very much expressing the spirit of the age. The role of force in politics had been given greater attention in political reflections of both left and right. Now, the final blow to the constitution-centered view of politics was dealt by Bonapartism. As I said, Bonapartism made a big impact on von Rochau's understanding of politics. He wrote a book on the Bonapartist coup and dedicated to it the closing chapter of his History of France, in which the role of violence and force is pronounced, as is the fragility of the constitution. In the Principles of Realpolitik, von Rochau characterized Louis Bonaparte's coup as an epochal moment in modern political history. He confronted his reader with the following shocking fact. citing the people that have for 2 generations stood at the helm of European movement, that is, revolutionary movement, that have, in the name of civic freedom, gone through a string of most difficult trials and withstood them, that after the fall of Napoleonic domination seem to have made themselves completely at home in the parliamentarian system. These people have overnight left back into an absolutism which on this side of the Russian border does not have an equal any longer. So, as to the Russian, please changes. How was one to understood the fact that from the Rochau, how was one to understand the fact from Rochau asked that the highest official of the French people overthrew the constitution and the law. This case speaks about the gazettes, the public law, Recht of the country, and seized for himself a plenitude of power, thanks to which he can, with unlimited arbitrariness, command not only over the state institutions, but also over the life, freedom, and property of citizens. From Rochau's answer was, these events hold one of the biggest political lessons that history has ever taught. What emerges from them in the first place, and with an unprecedented clarity, is the incurable nothingness of constitutions which seek to separate public law from public power, that confront the armed power with unarmed right. The politics of facts overthrows governments and creates governments. The constitutional politics, on the contrary, has essentially nothing else to do but to recognize the existing powers and consecrate them with the written law. From Rochau's principles of realpolitik are commonly seen as a reformulation of liberal politics based on the experience of the defeat of the 1848 revolution, and as such as an accommodation or adaptation of liberalism to the post-revolutionary or counter-revolutionary times. The question around which turn interpretations of von Rochau's work is thus the question of the defeat of the revolution. The question is what the revolution really defeated. In von Rochau's view, the constitution of a state was determined by reciprocal relations among the forces within the state that are either active or passive. Each social force claims a standing within the state that corresponds to its magnitude, and the state power itself is solely the sum of social forces that the state has integrated into itself. From this, let's call it social point of view, it would appear that neither the revolution nor its defeat did interrupt the rise of the middle class, to which von Rochau had linked liberalism. This kind of looking at the revolution was represented also by the historian Rochau Joyson. He held the view that the 1848 revolution was only a moment in a much broader social transformation that was changing, citing him, all the basics and conditions of European life, all social and state forces, all mental and material factors. So that revolutionary transformation had continued after 1848 with an insuperable force. So from the social point of view, we don't really have a break with the revolution. From the political point of view, the forces which contemporary observers saw as defeated were, first, the proletarians or laboring classes. Others spoke about the democratic forces, and in connection with that, the radical republicans, and the people, or the popular politics. In a word, the losers of the 1848 were the popular masses. On the basis of such analysis, the contemporaries drew the distinction between economic and political revolution and regarded the latter as losing and the former as winning. Liberals were rarely mentioned as the losers. They were, however, criticized from left and right, and liberalism was even dead already then. The reactionary Auguste Comte, for example, saw the accomplishment of the liberal idea in its ending up in the hands of the poor, who had risen in revolt against the well-to-do. That was the point, Comte wrote, at which the liberal idea accomplishes its last relish. In my reflections on that which is wrong with the liberal ideas, nothing has struck me more than this extreme result of their application, which was inevitable. Rousseau considered socialism and the revolt of the popular masses as the logical outcome or consequence of liberalism, which spelled an end to liberalism itself. Liberals themselves became scared of socialism and afraid of the historical dialectics that was set in motion and was now turning against them. Once socialism appeared to them like a logical development of liberalism, the liberals had to block the development so it would not empower social and political forces opposed to liberalism. But by doing so, they themselves paralyzed liberalism. This dialectics of the self-paralysis of liberalism was well captured by Karl Marx in his first critique of Bonapartism. He depicted how the liberals began to be afraid of their own ideas and principles as socialistic, and distanced themselves from them. They grasped that civil liberties threatened their class domination. What bourgeoisie had earlier celebrated as liberal, Marx wrote, it now denounced as socialistic. But that meant denouncing liberalism. When the liberal bourgeoisie, in order to defend itself, attacked socialism, it had to curtail civil liberties and thus thwart liberal ideas and principles. In order to protect itself from being negated by socialism, liberalism negated itself. And in negating itself, its principles and ideas, the liberal bourgeoisie both itself reached for repression and made the way for a repressive, dictatorial, Bonapartist regime to step in. This sheds a different light on the question of the reformulation of liberal politics. Liberalism did not simply adapt the outcome of the revolution, but had contributed to the outcome, to the suppression of civil liberties, to repression, to the defeat of the popular masses, and of political revolution. In the end, it benefited from the economic revolution, which gained momentum when political revolution was defeated. In a nutshell, von Rochau's redefinition of liberal politics was composed of the acceptance of the defeat of political revolution and the embrace of economic revolution. But this redefinition of liberal politics truncated his realpolitik. It seems like liberalism and realpolitik are really incompatible. The law of power applied to the political sphere. It was about the abandonment of liberal ideas and principles, and the recognition of the central role of force and power in politics and government. But this law of power did not extend into the economic sphere. This did not mean that there was no power within the sphere of economy. It meant that economic power was not subject to realpolitik and its law of power. When the law of power dominated the state was not allowed to govern the economy. The real political language of power was muted when it came to economy. Not only did von Rochau himself abstain from using the language of power in discussing economic life of society, he also polemicized against those who did use it. He accused, for example, the Berliner press, who was sympathetic to socialism, of using the language of toxic demagogy against the bourgeoisie, against the monopoly of capital, against the exploitation of the worker by the entrepreneur. Yes, even against the machinery. Arguing that the existing national economic system originated only in the selfishness and greed of money men, and as such had to be transformed from the bottom up for the benefit of the laboring classes, was for von Rochau nothing short of incitement. Most of what von Rochau had to say about economy, he said in the context of polemics against socialism. While the reformulation of liberal politics edged towards supporting such an iconic anti-liberal political figure as Otto von Bismarck, it clearly opposed socialism. Whereas von Rochau and the socialists agreed that there was no power in this world that was able to prevent or even undo the transformation of crafts into factory systems, and also that transformation brought about serious wrongs and evils, they had very different views on how to deal with the wrongs and evils. Von Rochau agreed that the economic condition of the poorest popular classes had to be bettered. Yet that had to be done prudently and within certain limits. Such a prudent, limited improvement he called social reform. The socialists, on the other hand, called for social revolution. So Rochau rejected social revolution as a violent and radical change of power for which one needed only a sufficient number of fists. That, a big enough force to be politically effective, was exactly what realpolitik was about. Yet when it came to socialism, that argument did not count. The limits that defined social reform, on the other hand, were the limits to the state action. The improvement of the economic conditions of the poor required state action. That was, at that time, still evident, or self-evident. The question was how large a room for action the state should be given. For Rochau's answer was unequivocal. However big a room for action is given to state measures for this purpose, they meet their limit in property rights. Whereas remedying economic suffering was the economic task of the state, that task had to be fulfilled within those limits. That is, the limits defined by property. It was not the state that defined the scope of its own action or its limits. The power that drew the limits to the state power was economic. There are economic limits to state power, yet no political limits to economic power. From the Rochau's preferred big means of social reform were two: reducing the cost of running the state, that is, budget cuts, and freedom of exercising economic force, today we say free market. So again, nothing new under the sun. The perception of wrongs and evils shifted from economic suffering of the poorest popular classes to state spending and impediments on economic freedom. The oversized budgets and the laws that, under different pretexts, impede the freedom of economic movements on the world, these are the two and sole biggest evils in the economic realm. What one might expect from politics was the removal of those two evils. The rest of the wrongs will be taken care of by the slow, organic development, by the development of the economic forces of the people, in which politics has solely the task of warding off external interference without becoming an external interference itself. As to the proletariat, which was suffering the wrongs and evils of the existing economic system, von Rochau suggested that an honest and smart thing to do would be to bluntly tell them that by and large one cannot help them in any other way but by creating the legal possibilities that they can help themselves. Von Rochau not only reminded his readers of the German folk wisdom, help yourself and God will help you, he also brought up what he called the motto of the North American entrepreneurial spirit and of the North American labor force, which was help yourself. This was the magic formula which in 2 generations made America a first-class economic power and created a general welfare such as had not been seen in the whole history. What concerns economy, in view of realpolitik, we have magical thinking. One could describe this as a staple laissez-faire. The irony of it would be that from the Rochau, it is turning away from philosophy in his realistic commitment to facts, ended up with embracing philosophy. For, as Keynes was to say, that is what laissez-faire actually was. But the really intriguing thing was that this was part of a project to formulate the notion of realpolitik as a theoretical basis for the politics of new liberalism. So the term new liberalism was used by von Rochau's contemporary Constantin Franz. This statist politics turned the state into a handmaiden of economy. Instead of sticking to facts to which realpolitik was committed, declaratively committed, a set of facts was kept beyond question. Even more seriously, those were the facts that involved power. The exercise of power within the economic realm was close to political thinking. Instead of analyzing the exercise of economic power, von Rochau spoke of development of economic forces, increase of economic productivity and efficiency, and of course, freedom. While those who wielded economic power were free from state interference, but held by the state against external impediments, the proletarians were given the freedom to be proletarians. As Rochau put it, the free use of their economic force is the most rightful, the most irrefutable demand which the proletariat can make from the state. The state power was limited by economic power, while economic power was kept politically unlimited. The law of power did not extend into the realm of economy. It was limited to reflections upon the state and politics, while economic power, never named, was the law unto itself, legibus solutus. As such, it was in no conceivable sense an institution. Discussing the crisis of liberalism early in the 20th century, John Hobbes wrote of the shipwreck which continental liberalism had suffered when it was driven on the submerged reefs of the economic problem in politics. One says that already von Rochau's realpolitik was shipwrecked on economic power, which he himself turned into a submerged reef. But the failure of von Rochau's realpolitik project did not impact on his successful reformulation of liberalism. In fact, very failure, so the success of the reformulation of liberalism lay in that exact failure, that is, in the exemption of economic power from political reflection and control. Thank you.